open this gate! This land belongs to the HOA!
You never owned my property. You only dumped your problems on it. This isn't a nature preserve.
Brenda actually believed her plastic HOA badge made her the undisputed queen of the county. She never bothered checking the property lines before trying to steal my land. When that heavy iron gate slammed shut, it didn't just lock her out, it completely destroyed her local empire. Here's my story. For years, I had been saving every spare dime I earned working as a commercial structural engineer in Chicago, dreaming of the day I could trade the concrete jungle for a slice of absolute silence. I didn't want a manicured lawn, and I certainly didn't want neighbors peering over a vinyl fence to judge my weekend projects. I wanted land. Real, untamed, heavily wooded land. After 18 months of scouring real estate listings across the Midwest, I finally found the Holy Grail, 58 acres of pristine, old-growth timber sitting just outside the municipal boundary of a rapidly expanding suburb in Ohio. The property featured a natural spring, rolling hills, and a breathtaking ridge view. It was being sold by an 82-year-old widower named George Abernathy, who had inherited the land from his father but hadn't set foot on it in over a decade due to his failing knees. The asking price was surprisingly low. I assumed it was because the property was raw and undeveloped, requiring a well and septic system to be installed. But when I met George at the local diner to shake hands on the deal, he nervously stirred his black coffee and looked out the window. "Jason," George said, his voice raspy, "I need to be straight with you before we sign the final papers. The land is beautiful, but it borders Crestview Meadows. Do you know about them?" I shook my head. "Just looks like a typical upscale subdivision on the map." George chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "It's an HOA, but not just any HOA. The president is a woman named Brenda Carmichael. Over the last 5 years, she and her board have turned that neighborhood into a little North Korea. They fine people for having the wrong shade of white on their mailbox, but the real issue is how they treat my property." He explained that because the 58 acres had sat vacant for so long, the HOA had started treating it as their own private nature preserve. The only paved access to my new property was a quarter-mile stretch of county road that legally dead-ended into my dirt driveway. However, 15 years ago, the developers of Crestview Meadows built their gated community around that county road. Legally, the road was a public easement, but visually, to get to my land, you had to drive past the faux stone entrance pillars of the HOA, pass a dozen cookie-cutter McMansions, and continue to the very back of the neighborhood where the pavement abruptly turned into my dirt track. Brenda thinks because my land sits behind their houses, it falls under their jurisdiction, George warned. She's harassed every prospective buyer I've had. "I just want you to know what you're walking into." I smiled, thanked George for his honesty, and signed the papers anyway. I was an engineer who dealt with municipal zoning boards and aggressive city inspectors for a living. I wasn't going to let a power-tripping suburbanite scare me away from my dream property. 2 weeks later, the deed was recorded in my name. I was officially the owner of 58 acres of freedom. To get started on the property, I bought a used 30-foot Airstream trailer and hauled it up the dirt access road to a clearing about 200 yards past the HOA boundary line. I planned to live in the trailer for the summer while I cleared the site for my future cabin, dug the trenches for the utility lines, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. The peace and quiet lasted exactly 48 hours. It was a crisp Tuesday morning. I was sitting on a folding chair outside the Airstream, drinking a cup of coffee and listening to the birds, when I heard the high-pitched whine of an electric motor straining against the incline of my dirt road. Up the hill came a custom, lifted golf cart painted a hideous shade of metallic teal. Behind the wheel was a woman in her late 50s, wearing oversized designer sunglasses, a tennis skirt, and a visor that seemed glued to her tightly sprayed blonde hair. Beside her sat a nervous-looking man in a polo shirt, clutching a thick 3-ring binder. The golf cart skidded to a halt a few feet from my fire pit. The woman marched out, heels sinking slightly into the mud, and planted her hands on her hips. "Excuse me," she barked, her voice cutting through the morning air like a circular saw. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I stood up slowly, taking a sip of my coffee. "Good morning. I'm enjoying my breakfast. Can I help you?" "I am Brenda Carmichael, president of the Crestview Meadows Homeowners Association," she announced, puffing her chest out. "And this is Greg Farnsworth, my vice president. You are currently trespassing on Phase 2 of the Crestview Nature Preserve. Furthermore, recreational vehicles are strictly prohibited within the community limits under Section 4, Paragraph B of our bylaws. You have exactly 1 hour to pack up this eyesore and leave, or I will have you arrested for trespassing and illegally dumping a vehicle." I stared at her, genuinely amazed. George hadn't been exaggerating. She really believed she owned the horizon. "Brenda," I said politely, keeping my voice calm, "I think there's a misunderstanding. This isn't Phase 2 of anything. This is private property. My private property. I bought the 58 acres from George Abernathy. The property line ends at the tree line 200 yards back down the hill." Brenda let out a sharp, condescending laugh. She turned to Greg, who offered a weak, sycophantic chuckle in return. "Nice try," Brenda sneered, pulling off her sunglasses to glare at me. "Old man Abernathy forfeited this land years ago when he stopped maintaining it. We have assumed administrative control over this acreage for the benefit of the community. It is a designated green space. You cannot just park a trashy trailer here and claim you bought it." "I have the recorded deed from the county," I replied, my patience beginning to thin. "I suggest you go down to the assessor's office and look it up. Now, unless you have business with me, I'm going to have to ask you to leave my property." Brenda's face turned the color of a ripe plum. She snatched the heavy binder from Greg's hands, flipped to a tab section, and ripped out a piece of carbon copy paper. She grabbed a pen, scribbled furiously for a few seconds, and then marched forward, slapping the paper onto the aluminum side of my Airstream. "That is a $500 fine for unauthorized parking of an RV, and a $200 fine for unauthorized clearing of brush," she snapped. "If this metal monstrosity isn't gone by tomorrow morning, the fines will double, and I will call the towing company." With that, she spun on her heel, marched back to her teal golf cart, and sped off down the dirt road, leaving a cloud of dust in her wake. I walked over to the Airstream, pulled the slip of paper off the side, and read it. It was a formal HOA violation notice, complete with a threatening legal disclaimer at the bottom. I laughed out loud, crumpled it into a ball, and tossed it into my fire pit. The war had officially begun, and Brenda had no idea who she was dealing with. Over the next week, I completely ignored Brenda and her ridiculous citations. I had real work to do. I hired a local excavation crew to come out and start grading the area where my cabin foundation would go, and I scheduled a well drilling company to find water. But dealing with Crestview Meadows was like dealing with a swarm of relentless mosquitoes. On Thursday, the excavation contractor, a burly guy named Dave, called me at 7 in the morning. He was fuming. "Jason, I'm sitting at the entrance to this fancy neighborhood, and there's a guy in a silver SUV parked sideways across the road, blocking my heavy equipment." Dave grumbled through the phone. "Says he's HOA security and that commercial vehicles aren't allowed on the roads before 9 a.m. I immediately hopped into my truck and drove down the dirt road until it turned into the paved county road, intersecting the back of the neighborhood. Sure enough, Greg Farnsworth, the nervous vice president, was sitting in his Lexus SUV, physically blocking the public easement. Dave's massive flatbed, hauling an excavator, was idling loudly just behind him. I walked up to Greg's window and tapped on the glass. He rolled it down exactly 2 inches. "Move the car, Greg," I said, my voice dangerously low. "Brenda's orders," Greg stammered, adjusting his glasses. "No heavy machinery. It disturbs the residents' morning routines. And furthermore, you haven't submitted your architectural plans to the review board. Greg, you are blocking a county easement. This is a public road, and you are obstructing traffic. If you don't move this vehicle in 10 seconds, I'm calling the sheriff, and I will personally press charges for unlawful detainment." Greg looked at my face, then looked at Dave, who was cracking his knuckles through the windshield of the semi-truck. Greg swallowed hard, put the Lexus in drive, and hastily backed into a nearby driveway to let the machinery pass. As Dave's truck rumbled up the hill to my land, I realized Brenda wasn't just an annoyance. She was actively trying to sabotage my build. I needed to establish hard, undeniable boundaries. I called a licensed surveyor named Ken Miller and paid him a premium to come out the very next day to mark my exact property lines with bright pink wooden stakes and surveyor's tape. While I waited for Ken to arrive on Friday, I decided to take a long hike through the eastern edge of my 58 acres, a densely wooded ravine that I hadn't fully explored yet. It bordered the most expensive homes in Crestview Meadows, including Brenda's massive brick colonial. As I pushed through the thick underbrush, swatting away branches, a foul smell hit my nose. I crested a small ridge and looked down into the ravine. My jaw dropped. There, sitting on a quarter-acre of my private land, was a massive, illegal dumping ground. Mountains of grass clippings, dead branches, discarded patio furniture, broken concrete pavers, and old paint cans were piled high between the old-growth trees. As I walked closer, I found discarded bags of fertilizer and empty buckets of pool chemicals leaking into the soil less than 200 yards from the natural spring I planned to use for my drinking water. Among the trash, I found several discarded work orders from a company called Elite Landscapes, the very company whose trucks I had seen manicuring the common areas of Crestview Meadows. Suddenly, everything made perfect sense. Brenda hadn't just claimed my land as a nature preserve out of a delusional sense of grandeur. She was actively using my property as a secret, illegal landfill for the HOA. By instructing her landscaping contractors to dump their debris and chemical waste in my ravine instead of hauling it to the county dump, she was likely saving the HOA thousands of dollars a year and making herself look like a financial genius to the board. If a buyer ever developed this land, her dirty little secret and her environmental crimes would be exposed. I pulled out my phone and took dozens of photos, documenting the chemical buckets, the debris, and the exact GPS coordinates. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This was an environmental hazard. When I hiked back to the trailer, Ken, the surveyor, had arrived. We spent the next 4 hours walking the perimeter, driving 3-foot wooden stakes with bright pink tape into the ground every 50 feet. Ken was meticulous, using GPS equipment to confirm the lines down to the centimeter. As we approached the border separating my dirt road from the HOA's paved road, I heard the familiar whine of the teal golf cart. Brenda was speeding toward us, flanked by Greg and a third woman I didn't recognize. "Stop what you are doing immediately," Brenda shrieked, slamming the brakes. She pointed a trembling finger at Ken. "You! Remove those stakes! This is HOA property. You are vandalizing a green space." Ken, a seasoned professional in his 60s who had dealt with every kind of crazy neighbor imaginable, didn't even look up from his tripod. "Ma'am, please step back. You're interfering with a legal survey." "I am calling the police," Brenda screamed, pulling a sleek smartphone from her pocket. "I am having you both arrested." "Please do, Brenda," I said, leaning against a tree. "Make sure you tell them to bring a supervisor." 15 minutes later, a county sheriff's cruiser rolled up the road, lights flashing. Officer Davis, a no-nonsense cop with a tired expression, stepped out of the vehicle. Brenda practically sprinted toward him, waving a stack of HOA violation notices. "Officer! Thank God!" she gasped, playing the victim perfectly. "These men are trespassing on Crestview property. They are driving stakes into the ground, destroying our nature preserve, and refusing to leave." Officer Davis looked at the pink stakes, looked at Ken's professional equipment, and then walked over to me. "Can I see your ID, sir?" he asked. I handed him my driver's license and a notarized copy of the property deed, along with a certified plat map I had brought down from the county clerk's office. Officer Davis reviewed the paperwork in silence. Then he turned to Brenda. "Ma'am," the officer sighed, "this paperwork is in order. Mr. Brooks owns this land, all 58 acres of it. He has every right to survey it." "That's a forged document," Brenda yelled, losing whatever composure she had left. "We have maintained that land for years. It belongs to the community by adverse possession. My lawyer says so." "Then take it up in civil court," Officer Davis replied sternly. "But as of right now, this is his property. If you cross this line of pink stakes, Mr. Brooks can have you arrested for trespassing. Do I make myself perfectly clear, Mrs. Carmichael?" Brenda looked like she was going to have a stroke. She glared at me with a hatred so pure it could have burned a hole in steel. She didn't say another word. She just spun around, marched to her golf cart, and drove away, with Greg scurrying after her. As the officer left, I looked at the surveyor's stakes, then down the county road that led into the HOA. I knew Brenda wouldn't stop. The illegal dump site in the ravine proved she had too much to lose. If she wanted to play dirty, I was going to shut her down permanently. It was time to build the gate. First thing Monday morning, I didn't call a lawyer. I called the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency. When you tell the state that a corporate entity is illegally dumping industrial pool chemicals and commercial fertilizers near an active natural spring, they don't drag their feet. By Tuesday afternoon, a senior environmental inspector named Robert Jenkins was standing in my driveway, pulling on a pair of heavy rubber boots and adjusting a hard hat. Robert was a tall, methodical man who looked like he had zero tolerance for suburban nonsense. I led Robert through the dense woods to the eastern ravine. The smell was even worse than before, exacerbated by the warm afternoon sun baking the discarded grass clippings and leaking chemical buckets. Robert stood at the edge of the ridge, taking out a digital camera and a clipboard. He didn't say a word for a full 2 minutes, just documenting the sheer scale of the illegal landfill. "Mr. Brooks," Robert finally sighed, shaking his head. "I've seen some brazen illegal dumping in my 20-year career, but this is spectacularly arrogant. They didn't even try to hide the evidence." He pointed to a massive pile of discarded patio furniture, where a faded plastic sign clearly read Crestview Meadows Community Pool Rules. We spent 3 hours down in that ravine. Robert took soil samples, water samples from the nearby spring runoff, and meticulously cataloged the hazardous materials. The worst offenders were the cracked 5-gallon buckets of chlorine and algicide, which were visibly seeping into the muddy soil. "Here is what happens next," Robert explained as we hiked back to my trailer. "I am placing an immediate environmental hold on this section of your property. We will be launching a full investigation. Given the branding on this debris, the Crestview Meadows HOA and their landscaping contractor are going to be in the crosshairs. Do not let anyone from that neighborhood back here to tamper with the evidence." "I'm way ahead of you, Robert," I replied with a grin. As soon as the inspector drove away, I made a phone call to a commercial security and fencing company in the next county over. I didn't want a flimsy aluminum gate that someone could push open with a bumper. I wanted a fortress. I ordered a custom, heavy-duty wrought iron gate, flanked by 10-foot-tall reinforced steel posts that would be set deep into concrete footings. It was solar-powered, equipped with a cellular keypad, and featured high-definition security cameras pointing in every direction. It was an expensive investment, but completely worth it for the peace of mind. While I waited for the gate to be fabricated, Brenda escalated her campaign of harassment. Since she couldn't legally cross my property line without facing arrest, she resorted to paper terrorism. First came the certified letters. A strip mall attorney she had hired sent me a cease and desist, claiming my planned cabin construction violated the aesthetic harmony of the adjacent community. I filed it straight into my campfire. Then, she started calling in bogus complaints to the county building inspector, claiming I was operating an illegal commercial logging operation because I was clearing dead brush. The inspector came out, saw my perfectly legal site prep, rolled his eyes, and left. Brenda even tried to get the post office to stop delivering my mail to the temporary mailbox I had set up at the county road intersection. But her absolute favorite tactic was sitting in her teal golf cart, right on the edge of the pavement, glaring at me through binoculars while I worked. She was waiting for me to slip up. She was waiting for a chance to strike. She got her chance on a rainy Thursday morning when the concrete trucks arrived to set the massive steel pillars for my new gate. Dave and his excavation crew had dug holes 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide on either side of the dirt road, exactly 2 inches behind the pink surveyor stakes that marked my property line. As the first cement mixer rumbled through the manicured streets of Crestview Meadows and approached my boundary, Brenda swerved her golf cart directly into the middle of the road, blocking the massive truck. I walked down the hill in the pouring rain, watching the standoff. "You cannot bring commercial concrete trucks through this neighborhood," she shrieked at the driver, waving her arms. "The weight will destroy our custom asphalt. Turn around immediately." The driver, a burly guy chewing heavily on a piece of gum, just blasted his air horn. Brenda covered her ears but refused to move. I stepped up to the edge of my property. "Brenda, this is a public county easement. You do not own this road. If you don't move, I will call Officer Davis again, and this time I will press charges for reckless endangerment and obstructing a public roadway. I am protecting my neighborhood from your industrial trash," she screamed back, rain plastering her hair to her face. I pulled out my phone and dialed the non-emergency dispatch number right in front of her. I spoke loudly enough for her to hear every word. "Yes, dispatch. I need a deputy out here. We have an individual intentionally blocking heavy construction equipment on a public road." Brenda's face twisted in absolute fury. She slammed her golf cart into reverse, tires spinning on the wet pavement, and backed out of the way. She sat there, fuming, as 3 massive concrete trucks rolled past her and onto my dirt road. By sunset, the massive steel pillars were set, and the heavy iron gate was hung. I punched my custom code into the keypad. The heavy metal gears ground to life, and the massive wrought iron doors swung shut with a resounding, metallic clang. The magnetic lock engaged. My 58 acres were completely sealed off from Crestview Meadows. The reign of Brenda Carmichael over this land was officially over. But the true drama was just beginning. The real beauty of the gate wasn't just its physical presence, it was the timing. For years, the HOA's landscaping company, Elite Landscapes, had been using my property as their private, cost-saving dump site. They operated under a very specific schedule. Every Monday morning, a fleet of their trucks would descend on Crestview Meadows, mow the massive common areas, trim the extensive shrubbery, and then discreetly haul the debris up the dirt road to dump in the ravine. I knew they were coming. So, on Sunday night, I mounted 3 high-definition, motion-activated trail cameras directly facing the new gate. Then, I made a fresh pot of coffee, sat by the window of my Airstream, and waited for Monday morning. At exactly 8:15 a.m., the deep rumble of diesel engines echoed up the hill. A convoy of 3 heavy-duty dump trucks bearing the Elite Landscapes logo drove past the pristine McMansions of Crestview Meadows, expecting to coast right up my dirt road as they always did. Instead, the lead truck slammed on its brakes, skidding slightly on the pavement. From my vantage point, I watched as the driver hopped out of the cab, staring up at the massive, 10-foot-tall wrought iron gate that now completely blocked his path. He walked up, rattled the heavy steel bars, and then aggressively pushed the intercom button on the keypad. My cell phone buzzed. I answered the intercom through the app. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice echoing out of the gate's speaker. "Hey, I need the gate code," the driver grunted. "We've got yard waste to drop off." "There is no drop-off," I replied smoothly. "This is private property. You are trespassing. Turn your trucks around." "Look, buddy, Brenda gave us permission. We have a contract with the HOA to use the back acreage. Open the gate, or I'm calling her." "I strongly encourage you to call Brenda," I said, smiling to myself. "But if those trucks aren't moved from my property line in 5 minutes, I'm calling the sheriff." I ended the call. Less than 10 minutes later, a familiar high-pitched whine pierced the morning air. The teal golf cart practically flew up the hill, skidding to a halt behind the dump trucks. Brenda leaped out, flanked by a terrified-looking Greg Farnsworth. She was practically vibrating with rage. She marched up to the gate, grabbed the iron bars, and shook them with all her might. The gate didn't budge a millimeter. "Open this gate immediately," she screamed into the intercom camera. "You have no right to build this. You are violating an established utility easement. I demand you open this gate so our contractors can do their jobs." I walked out of my trailer and strolled down the hill, stopping safely behind the locked iron bars. "Good morning, Brenda," I said cheerfully. "There is no utility easement. This is a private driveway, and your contractors cannot come in here because they are not dumping another ounce of toxic waste on my land." Brenda's eyes darted nervously toward the landscaping crew, then back to me. "I don't know what you're talking about. We are maintaining a green space." "No, Brenda. You are running an illegal, unpermitted hazardous waste dump," I said, my voice dropping its cheerful tone. "And the Ohio EPA agrees with me." At the mention of the EPA, the color completely drained from Brenda's face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Greg Farnsworth physically took a step back, his eyes wide with panic. "That's right," I continued, leaning against the cold iron of the gate. "The state inspector took soil and water samples last week. They found your pool chemicals, your fertilizers, and decades of illegal dumping. I'm sure you'll be hearing from them very soon." The owner of Elite Landscapes, a gruff man named Mike Sullivan, had walked up to the gate during my speech. He looked at Brenda, then looked at me. "Wait, you don't own this land?" Mike asked Brenda, his voice rising in anger. "You told me the HOA owned this ravine. You told me we could dump here to cut our disposal costs so you could keep our contract under budget." "Shut up, Mike," Brenda hissed, finally finding her voice. "I'm not going down for environmental crimes because you lied to me," Mike yelled back. He turned to his crew. "Get back in the trucks. We're leaving. We're hauling this to the county dump, and I'm billing the HOA for every penny." As the landscaping trucks hastily reversed and drove away, Brenda stood at the gate, gripping the iron bars. Her empire of control was slipping through her fingers, and the reality of what she had done was finally crashing down on her. She shot me one final venomous glare before silently returning to her golf cart and driving off. 3 days later, the hammer fell. A fleet of white state vehicles descended on Crestview Meadows. The EPA did not mess around. They served the Crestview Meadows Homeowners Association with a massive binder of violations. Because Mike Sullivan was terrified of losing his business license, he immediately flipped on Brenda, providing the state investigators with years of emails where Brenda explicitly ordered his company to dump waste on the adjacent property to artificially lower the HOA's landscaping budget. The state ordered an immediate, mandatory environmental cleanup of the ravine. Because it involved hazardous pool chemicals near a water source, the cleanup required specialized hazmat teams. The estimated cost of the remediation was staggering, nearly $300,000. Furthermore, the state slapped the HOA with an additional $80,000 in punitive fines. By Friday evening, the entire neighborhood was in absolute chaos. The HOA board, desperate to cover the massive fines and cleanup costs, was forced to issue an emergency special assessment to every single homeowner in Crestview Meadows. Each household was suddenly hit with a mandatory bill for over $6,000, payable within 30 days. The backlash was biblical. I sat on my porch, sipping a cold beer, listening to the muffled sounds of a screaming match echoing from the HOA clubhouse down the hill. Brenda's subjects were finally revolting. The morning after the catastrophic emergency HOA meeting, my gate intercom buzzed. I checked the camera feed on my phone, expecting to see Brenda demanding access or another confused delivery driver. Instead, it was Greg Farnsworth. He wasn't in his usual pressed polo and khakis. He looked disheveled, sporting a 5 o'clock shadow and holding a white bakery box like a white flag of surrender. I walked down the dirt road, keeping the heavy iron gate securely locked between us. "Jason," Greg said, his voice trembling slightly. He held up the bakery box. "I brought donuts. From that local place in town you mentioned to Dave the excavator. I wanted to come up here and personally apologize to you, on behalf of myself, and whatever is left of the Crestview Meadows Homeowners Association." I crossed my arms, amused but cautious. "I appreciate the gesture, Greg, but apologies don't clean up toxic waste. What happened at the clubhouse last night?" I could hear the yelling from my airstream. Greg let out a long, exhausted sigh, rubbing his temples. It was an absolute bloodbath. When the residents got the letters about the $6,000 special assessment, they lost their minds. Over 150 people showed up to the clubhouse. Brenda tried to run the meeting like she always does, banging her little wooden gavel and threatening to fine people for speaking out of turn. But it didn't work this time. They practically chased her off the podium. According to Greg, Brenda had desperately tried to spin the narrative, claiming that I was a malicious outside developer who had bribed the EPA to extort the neighborhood. But Mike Sullivan, the landscaping contractor, had sent a mass email to every resident in the community directory, attaching the direct email chains where Brenda ordered him to dump the chemical waste on my land to save money. The proof was undeniable. The board voted unanimously to strip her of her presidency, Greg explained, looking down at his shoes. And then she got hit with the real bad news. Our HOA attorney reviewed the community's directors' and officers' liability insurance policy. It turns out there is a strict exclusion for criminal acts and intentional environmental violations, meaning the insurance won't cover the EPA fines, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. Exactly, Greg nodded. The neighborhood still has to pay the state for the physical cleanup, but the homeowners coalition immediately drafted a civil lawsuit against Brenda personally. They are suing her for breach of fiduciary duty, gross negligence, and fraud to recoup the entire $380,000 bill. She's completely ruined, Jason. She was crying hysterically, screaming that we were all ungrateful peasants who didn't appreciate the aesthetic perfection she brought to our lives. I almost felt a fleeting moment of pity for her, but then I remembered the leaking buckets of algicide seeping toward my natural spring. Well, Greg, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Tell your cleanup crews they have access to the ravine starting Monday, but only under the strict supervision of the state inspector. For the next 3 weeks, my property became a bustling, hazardous waste site. Men in white Tyvek suits and heavy respirators marched up and down the ravine, carefully excavating decades of contaminated soil, loading it into specialized sealed containers, and hauling it away. I watched from the safety of my ridge, sipping my morning coffee as the massive, expensive machinery slowly undid years of Brenda's arrogant shortcuts. Through it all, the iron gate remained firmly locked. The cleanup crews had to access the ravine by parking on the county road and hauling the debris out by hand over the HOA property lines, a painstaking and wildly expensive process that only added to the neighborhood's financial misery. As for Brenda, her downfall was swift and absolute. Facing hundreds of thousands of dollars in personal liability and the utter hatred of her neighbors, she couldn't show her face in Crestview Meadows anymore. She couldn't even drive her teal golf cart to the mailbox without someone yelling obscenities at her. Within a month, a for sale sign went up in front of her massive brick colonial. But because the entire neighborhood was saddled with a massive, pending EPA special assessment, property values in Crestview Meadows had temporarily plummeted. No one wanted to buy into a community with a toxic waste scandal. Brenda was forced to slash her asking price 3 times. When the house finally sold, she took a massive loss, barely clearing enough equity to pay off the civil lawsuit from the homeowners. On a crisp autumn afternoon, I was finishing the framing on the front porch of my new, off-grid cabin. I heard the distant rumble of a large truck and walked down to the gate to check the cameras. It was a moving truck. Driving slowly behind it was Brenda's silver Mercedes SUV. She was leaving Crestview Meadows for good. As she drove past my locked iron gate, she didn't look up. She just stared straight ahead, a defeated woman who had traded her kingdom for a toxic dump. Today, my 58 acres are exactly what I dreamed they would be, an absolute sanctuary. The cabin is finished, the well water from my spring is crystal clear, and the ravine has been restored to a beautiful, natural state. The new HOA board leaves me completely alone, treating my property boundary like an electrified border wall. They know better than to test the man who dethroned their tyrant. Every time I hear the heavy metallic clang of my wrought iron gate locking shut behind me, I don't just feel secure, I feel victorious. That heavy iron gate didn't just protect my property, it dismantled a corrupt suburban dictatorship and restored the peace I always wanted. Sometimes, good fences really do make good neighbors, especially when they lock out a Karen for good. If you enjoyed hearing how Brenda's toxic empire finally collapsed, hit that like button, share this video with anyone who hates HOA drama, and subscribe to the channel for more crazy, real-life revenge stories